What if everything you thought you knew about the first book of the Bible was incomplete? For centuries, we've read Genesis as if it belonged to one world, a Middle Eastern world of deserts and olive trees, shepherds and stone altars. But what if there was another world woven into its pages? A world that begins in the beating heart of Africa. We've been taught to see Genesis through a narrow lens, a single familiar frame that leaves whole landscapes in the shadows. Yet in the oldest layers of the text, in the rivers, the symbols, and the poetry, there are echoes of the Nile, echoes of Kemet, echoes of stories told beneath African skies long before the Bible was written down. The rivers of Eden, the breath of life, the guardians of the garden, these are not only Middle Eastern ideas. They bear striking similarities to African creation myths, spiritual guardians, and cosmologies that stretch back thousands of years. And yet, for generations, these connections have been downplayed or dismissed. The colonial mind painted Africa as a backdrop in the Bible's story, a place where prophets fled or kings ruled, but never the source of the wisdom itself. Today we change that. This is not about replacing the Genesis you know. It's about restoring what was always there. It's about reading the Bible with a wider lens, one that includes the continent whose rivers, myths, and people shaped the ancient world in ways we're only beginning to rediscover. So open your mind, because once you see Genesis through African eyes, you can never unsee it. For most of us, the book of Genesis has always been introduced the same way. In Sunday school classrooms, in quiet family readings, in pulpits and sermons, the narrative feels fixed, sealed, unquestionable. It begins with, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." And from there the story unfolds in a straight line. Light, darkness, waters, land, humanity. We imagine an ancient, almost mythical Middle Eastern world where all this took place. Dusty landscapes, olive groves, desert hills, and shepherds tending their flocks. But here's the problem. That mental image we've carried for generations is only part of the story. It's the image we've inherited, not necessarily the one the original audience would have recognized. You see, Genesis did not emerge in a cultural vacuum. The world of the ancient Near East was not neatly divided into Africa on one side and the Bible on the other. The Red Sea, the Sinai, and the Nile Delta weren't barriers, they were bridges. Trade routes, caravans, and sea lanes linked ancient Egypt, Nubia, Kush, Punt, Canaan, and Mesopotamia into one interconnected world. This is where the story begins to shift. If you think of Genesis as a painting, we've been taught to view it under a single light source, a Middle Eastern lamp. But when you turn on another light, an African light, suddenly new colors appear. Details you never noticed before begin to stand out. Even the shape of the story changes. For centuries, Western biblical scholarship operated under a narrow assumption that the roots of Genesis were purely Mesopotamian and Hebrew, with Egypt playing a minor, almost decorative role. African civilizations were acknowledged, but only when they intersected with the biblical plot, like when Abraham visited Egypt, or when Joseph rose to power under Pharaoh. But this is not how ancient people saw the world. In their minds, Egypt, Kemet, was not a distant neighbor. It was the center of knowledge, agriculture, architecture, and spiritual thought. Its influence radiated south into Nubia and Punt, west into the Sahara and Sahel, and northeast into Canaan. To ignore Africa and the origins of Genesis is like trying to retell the story of the internet and leaving out Silicon Valley. It's not just incomplete, it's misleading. Here's what most people forget. The people who wrote and preserved Genesis lived in a world where African myths, cosmologies, and symbols were circulating freely. Egypt's creation story, the myth of the primeval waters called Nun, the emergence of the first mound of land, the life-giving role of the sun, and the shaping of humanity from clay, these were not locked away in temple walls. They were part of the cultural bloodstream. When the Hebrew people spent centuries in Egypt, they were not in isolation. They were immersed in African thought, African agricultural practices, African astronomical knowledge. The Nile's rhythms shaped their seasons just as much as the Jordan's. So why has this African connection been downplayed or ignored for so long? The answer is uncomfortable. From the colonial era onward, much of biblical interpretation was filtered through Eurocentric frameworks. These interpretations often placed Africa on the margins of civilization, a continent visited by the Bible's heroes, but never credited as a source of their wisdom. The result? Generations grew up believing Africa was simply a backdrop in biblical history, a place where famine drove people, where kings enslaved foreigners, where prophets fled danger. But never the place where the very ideas of Genesis could have taken shape. This is where we turn the story around. What happens if we read Genesis as part of Africa's intellectual history? What if Eden's rivers are mapped not only in Mesopotamia but also in the Nile basin? What if the breath of life and the dust of the ground carry the same meaning found in African oral traditions about humanity's birth? What if the guardians of Eden reflect the same spiritual archetypes as the protectors in West African and Nile Valley temples? We begin to see that Genesis is not just a Middle Eastern text, it is an African text too. And once we open that door, the rest of the book begins to feel different. The familiar becomes strange. The strange becomes familiar. The Garden of Eden might not be where we thought it was, or, at the very least, its imagery might be drawn from more than one cultural well. The Garden of Eden. For countless readers, it is the ultimate symbol of paradise, a perfect place untouched by suffering where humanity walked with God. Its rivers, its trees, its beauty have been etched into art and imagination for millennia. But behind the poetry lies geography. Genesis doesn't just say there was a garden. It gives directions. It names rivers. It anchors this spiritual origin story in the physical world. And here's where things get interesting. Genesis 2 verses 10 to 14 describes a river flowing out of Eden to water the garden, then dividing into 4 rivers. The Pishon, which winds through the land of Havilah, where there is gold. The Gihon, which winds through the whole land of Cush. The Tigris, running east of Assyria. The Euphrates, the great river of Mesopotamia. Most Sunday school maps place Eden somewhere between the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. But here's the problem. Cush is an African kingdom historically located in what is now Sudan and southern Egypt. The Gihon, according to Genesis, flows through Cush. And there is only one great river that has ever done that, the Nile. This means that in the biblical imagination, one of Eden's rivers was unquestionably African. Ancient Jewish commentators, from Josephus in the 1st century to medieval rabbis, often identified the Gihon with the Nile. In fact, in Ethiopian tradition, Eden is not thought of as somewhere in Mesopotamia, but as a source of rivers flowing toward both Africa and Asia. This is no small detail. It means the biblical writers were envisioning Africa as part of humanity's earliest sacred geography. Africa wasn't a footnote. It was part of the map of the beginning. Then there's the Pishon flowing through Havilah, where there is gold. The ancient world knew of Africa's gold-rich regions: Nubia, parts of Ethiopia, even lands farther south connected through trade. Egypt's wealth in large part came from Nubian gold mines. The biblical description of a lush, resource-rich land connected to Eden aligns perfectly with the African landscape known to the Hebrews. Geography is only the beginning. When we look at creation myths from Kemet, ancient Egypt, we find striking parallels to Genesis. In one Egyptian version, before anything existed, there was the dark, endless water of none. From this chaos, the first mound of earth emerged. On this mound, the Creator God, often Adam, brought forth life, shaping the world and eventually humanity. Compare this to Genesis, a darkness upon the face of the deep, the Spirit of God moving over the waters, a dry land appearing, humanity formed from the dust of the ground. Different languages, different names, but eerily similar patterns. And it's not just Egypt. Across the continent, from the Dogon of Mali to the Yoruba of Nigeria, we find creation stories that echo the Genesis structure. A formless world covered in water. A divine being sending messengers or spirits to create land. A humanity shaped from clay or earth, animated by breath. For the Yoruba, the deity Obatala descends to the watery chaos with a snail shell of sand, a chicken to scatter it and palm seeds to plant. For the Shilluk people of Sudan, the creator god Juk forms man from clay, kneads him like a potter and breathes life into him. The core imagery, water, land, clay, breath, is universal across these African traditions, and it matches the heart of Genesis. These are not just coincidences. They point to a shared symbolic language, one that traveled through trade routes, migrations, and centuries of cultural exchange. When the Hebrews told their story of creation in Eden, they were speaking in a vocabulary the ancient world already knew, a vocabulary with deep African roots. For centuries, Genesis has been read through the lens of European interpretation, a framework shaped by medieval theology, colonial expansion, and racialized narratives that subtly, and sometimes openly, pushed Africa into the margins of the biblical story. In the process, something profound was lost. The living heartbeat of the text when read with African eyes, on African soil, with African memory. Reclaiming this legacy begins by asking a simple but radical question. What happens when Genesis is read not as a European import, but as part of Africa's own ancient heritage? The opening chapters of Genesis are steeped in geographical references, rivers, lands, and peoples, that are often assumed to be exclusively Middle Eastern. But the text itself names Cush, Ethiopia, and regions flowing from the Nile as part of the biblical world from the very beginning. The Pishon and Gihon rivers mentioned in Genesis 2 are linked by many ancient scholars to African waterways. The land of Havilah is described as rich in gold and precious stones, qualities associated with ancient Nubia. When viewed with an African map in hand, Genesis shifts from being a distant myth to a family story, one rooted partly in the same soil that cradled the Nile civilizations. When the genealogies of Genesis are read in church pews today, they are often treated like dry, meaningless lists. But in African oral tradition, genealogies are the backbone of history. They are living threads connecting the present to the past, proving legitimacy, inheritance, and identity. Genesis lists, from Adam to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, are not random. They trace lines that include the descendants of Ham, from whom the biblical Cushites, Egyptians, and Canaanites emerged. In the African reimagining, these aren't others in the margins of the chosen people's story. They are co-ancestors shaping the biblical drama alongside Shem and Japheth's lines. Long before the Bible was ever written on scrolls, Africa had its own creation narratives, some strikingly similar to Genesis. In the Dogon traditions of Mali, humanity emerges from the divine word and water. In Yoruba cosmology, Olodumare sends Orishas to shape the earth from the waters below. These parallels are not accidents or imitations. They reflect a shared ancient memory of origins. When Genesis is approached with an African ear, its imagery resonates differently. The breath of life in Genesis 2 is not just poetic. It mirrors African understandings of vital force, the chi, the emi, the life spirit that connects human beings directly to God. The colonial era deliberately stripped the Bible of African presence in its teaching, because acknowledging Africa's deep role in the text threatened the racial hierarchies colonialism depended on. By rereading Genesis through African eyes, those filters are removed. Adam and Eve are no longer pale figures in a European garden painting. They are universal ancestors whose descendants include the Cushites of the Upper Nile, the dark-skinned peoples celebrated in ancient poetry, and the mighty kingdoms of the Sahara. Reimagining Genesis through an African lens is not just an academic exercise, it is an act of restoration. It restores African dignity in the biblical story. It bridges the Bible with African spirituality, showing that they are not enemies, but relatives in the same ancient family of faith. And it challenges the false historical divide that made many Africans feel the Bible was a foreign book. To reclaim this legacy is to tell our children, your story begins in Genesis 2. Your ancestors walked its rivers, spoke its names, and carried its wisdom. From the flowing waters of Eden's 4 rivers, to the sun-drenched palaces of Egypt, our journey through Genesis has taken us across landscapes that many never realized were African. We have walked the soil of Cush, stood on the banks of the Nile, and followed the bloodlines that connect Adam's descendants to the kingdoms of Nubia and Ethiopia. What we have uncovered is not simply an alternative reading of Scripture. It is the restoration of a heritage that has been quietly erased or reduced to footnotes. For too long, Africa's presence in the Bible has been framed as marginal, incidental, or even invisible. But when we look again without colonial filters, we see the truth. Africa is not just part of the biblical backdrop, it is part of its foundation. Reclaiming this lens changes more than just history books. It redefines identity. It bridges the supposed gap between African spirituality and the Judeo-Christian tradition. It shows that the God of Genesis is not foreign to African soil, but has been walking in its gardens, speaking through its rivers, and shaping its destiny since the dawn of humanity. This matters today because identity is power. A people who know their true place in the story of God cannot be made to feel like outsiders in their own faith. They will not be persuaded that they must abandon their roots to embrace the divine. Instead, they will recognize that their roots are already watered by the same streams that flowed from Eden. So I leave you with this challenge. Do not let these connections remain hidden in the shadows of history. Share this knowledge. Discuss it with your family, your friends, your community. Ask your pastors and teachers why these African connections are rarely mentioned. Demand that they be brought to light, not just for the sake of accuracy but for the sake of dignity and truth. The first book of the Bible may also be one of Africa's oldest stories. And the more we uncover, the more we see that this is not just history, it is inheritance. If this journey opened your eyes, then make sure it opens others too. Comment your thoughts below. Share this with someone who still thinks the Bible's roots are far from Africa. And subscribe because this is only the beginning. There are more hidden chapters, more untold stories, more truths waiting to be reclaimed. The rivers of Eden still flow, and their waters are calling us home.